Hey everyone, Professor Hill here, and I just wanted to offer a little bit of color that goes with the Ehrman article and the handout, the PDF handout about textual criticism and what we ought to do with it. It is a little bit of a journey to talk about textual criticism, but I thought we would take a little bit of time just to add a little bit of color to the handout and the reading. So I'm going to take a look. I'm going to make myself small up here, and I'm going to take a look just to walk through this. So when we talk about the text, and particularly what we're talking about is the text of the New Testament, and uh, when we talk about the text of the New Testament, the Bibles that we have, there are a number of manuscripts that we have available to us to piece that back together. And so, the whole process of transmitting a text, you can see how a letter would originally be written, or a gospel would originally be written, and it would be hand copied multiple times and then sent out to different other regions or churches. And so anytime you hand copy something, there are going to be differences between the documents. So the original and the copy, or the copy of the copy, or the copy of the copy of the copy, are going to have some differences simply by virtue of them being handwritten. So the issue of textual criticism is how the text of the New Testament, or the text of the Bible, survives and is transmitted before the era of printing. So really up until the 16th century, when the printing press, and we have our first printed version of the New Testament. Now, let me just say this: as the centuries go in the history of the church, what you start to see is really four distinct families of text. You have the Alexandrian text, the Western text, the Caesarean text, and the Byzantine text. I'm just going to head over here just so we can look at a map really quickly, which basically means this: that you had in the ancient world, though all these events are happening in Israel, Jerusalem. The Gospel of Matthew may have been written up here in Antioch. There's a number. John might have been written up here in Asia Minor. It's hard to say exactly where things were written, but we start to see that copies of these things, like let's say the letter to the Ephesians is written here in Ephesus, or is received in Ephesus, it gets copied and transmitted regionally. So maybe first up to Asia Minor, but then over to Syria, or to what is called the Byzantine texts area, the Alexandrian text area, and then you have the Western text. And when we talk about the difference between Eastern and Western, the Western text, the Western world, is really Italy West and Rome. And the primary language in the Western church is Latin. And then the Eastern church, Greece, Asia Minor, the Byzantine world, that is all going to be in Greek. And so what we're going to find out is that each of these manuscripts, or each of these text families, have various characteristics about them. You can read about what those are there. I think it is interesting when you think about the Western text. I think one of the really interesting things about the Western text is that the Western text of Acts is almost 10% longer than the Alexandrian text of Acts. So the texts that come out of the Western world are largely paraphrased, probably because their main language is Latin, not Greek, and the language of the New Testament is Greek. And so anytime you translate, you're going to end up doing some paraphrasing in that way. So all this to say, let me just get to you're like, why are we doing this? Where does the rubber meet the road? And I want to just say something about in the Western church, once you get a split between West and East, okay, Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic, the language of the Roman Catholic Church is going to be Latin. And so then the official language of the Western Church, the official Bible of the Western Church, is going to be the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. The Vulgate is going to be the main official text of the New Testament and Old Testament in the Western Church. The Eastern Church is going to largely use what we call the Byzantine text, or versions of the Byzantine text. Okay. Now, if you're at Fuller, you're probably part of the Reformation, right? You're part of the Reformed or the Reformation movement with Martin Luther, and then the various denominations that kind of spring off of that. Now, all of that is a phenomena of the Western Church. And so I'm going to go back to our handout here. And I just want to make note that if you wanted to read the Bible in Greek, okay, if you wanted to read the Bible in Greek in the 15th century, okay, you were largely reading the Byzantine text. The first printed edition, so moving away from handwritten New Testaments to a printed edition of the New Testament. Now remember, when printed editions show up, you no longer have textual variants. So anytime a manuscript disagrees with another manuscript, it is a textual variant. But once you start printing stuff, there are no longer textual variants. Now, the first printed edition of the Greek New Testament was prepared by Erasmus in 1516. And what he comes up with is, well, he uses largely the Byzantine text. And in some cases, he actually translates the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, back into Greek. Now, he prints that, and that becomes known as Textus Receptus, or the received text. Why is this important? Okay. One, it's important because this will be the text that all of the major Reformer Bibles get translated from. So Tyndale, Luther, eventually the King James Version of the Bible is translated from the received text. Okay. And actually, up until the 19th century, all English Bibles were translated from Textus Receptus. Now, the issue with Textus Receptus, and this is where you're going to get, if you have some friends who are like King James only, this is where you're going to start to get into issues. So in the received text, there are various textual variants that are not really critically examined. And we're going to take a look at a couple of them. But essentially what starts to happen is that you start to get some of these scholars like Karl Lachmann, in 1831. And what he starts to do is he starts going out and gathering as many Greek manuscripts as he possibly can find. And he starts to treat it as classical literature, essentially. And what he does is he then puts the text in the top portion of the page, and then he will put the, sorry, I'm going to move this down so you can see me a little bit more in here. Thank you. And he starts to treat essentially the Greek New Testament as classical literature. And anywhere that he finds two manuscripts that disagree, he puts those disagreements down in what is known as the apparatus in the bottom of the text. When you take Greek, you'll purchase a Greek New Testament and it'll have the apparatus. Now I'm going to show you, if I look over here at my Bible software, I've kind of set up a, over here on the left-hand side is the Greek New Testament with where it notes textual variants, okay? And then all over here on the right, this is the ESV. I could have any version up here, the New Revised Standard or whatever. There's some notes down here. And at the very bottom, what I've included is what is known as the apparatus. And so every time there's a textual variant, and I hover over what is known as sigla, the sign, it'll show at the very bottom, I'm going to move down here, it'll show the various manuscripts that hold to the various readings. And so this is how today we deal with textual variants when we are reading our Greek New Testament. All right, I'm going to come back to this in just a second, but let me go back to our reading. So basically what I wanted to point out is if you read Ehrman, Ehrman is a really interesting guy because he was a student of really the 20th century's most prolific textual scholar, who is Bruce Metzger. And Ehrman took over his work. But whereas Metzger was somewhat of a of a warm believer, or someone who was believing in the veracity of the New Testament, and that textual criticism was moving us back towards confidence towards an original manuscript, Ehrman actually has taken much more of an agnostic approach. That his approach, and even as you read, you'll note a few things, and he was pretty mild in this chapter, but Ehrman has been very much a skeptic about the veracity of the text of the New Testament. And he notes in a lot of ways, you'll get some of that in his reading, but I wanted to just give you a sense that textual criticism has typically been an exercise in trying to become more confident about the reading of the New Testament, not less confident at the reading of the New Testament. And so, just so we understand a little bit about this, you can read the Bart Ehrman, Daniel Wallace, The Differing Perspectives, and some of that. I just wanted to say, you can see Ehrman, not in your text, but in another place where he's written, is the text of the New Testament reliable? He says the reality is there's no way to know. If we had the originals, we could tell you. If we had the first copies, we could tell you. If we had copies of the copies, we could tell you. We don't have copies in many instances for hundreds of years after the originals. And then he goes on to say, there's places we'll probably never know. And that is a very skeptical, agnostic approach to the text of the New Testament. At the same time, Dan Wallace and this Stewart book, The Reliability of the New Testament, is a catalog of some debates between Bart Ehrman and Dan Wallace. And Wallace balances that today we have as many as, though we've got over 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. Most of those are after the 8th century, which really makes them of no use to us in determining the original reading. But Wallace says we have 12 manuscripts from the 2nd century. We have 64 manuscripts from the 3rd century, so the 400s, 48 from the 4th century. And what Wallace says is, hey, if we want to know, we have about 124 manuscripts within 300 years of the composition of the New Testament. Many are fragmentary, but collectively, the whole New Testament is found in them multiple times. And that this is really where this debate goes, is these really 120 plus manuscripts from the first 300 years of the New Testament. And so, or 300 years of the early church. And so there's various criteria that are used, and you can read through that. I don't want to belabor that, but what I did want to point out is essentially is, if we, should we be confident when we read the New Testament? And I would say yes. I would say that probably we have about 98% of the New Testament. We know pretty much what it said. There are times where the differences in manuscripts are so minuscule. It's about a spelling difference, or it's about a grammatical difference, or it's shifting words around. There are some places, however, where there are some major variants. And you're going to look at one of 3 major variants in the New Testament. And if you have a good modern translation of the Bible, it should alert you when you have a textual variant. And for some, if you've never encountered a textual variant before, the exercise that you're doing this week is going to walk you through that. Okay, so there's 3. And the first one that I'm going to point out is the ending of the Gospel of Mark. I'm looking at the ESV over here. And in the ESV, you'll notice that you have double brackets beginning at 16:9. And you'll also note that at 16:8, there's a note in whatever Bible you have. And of course, reading out of the ESV, it says that some manuscripts end the book with 16:8. Others include verses 9 through 20 immediately after verse 8. At least one manuscript inserts additional material after verse 14. Some manuscripts include after verse 8 the following, and then it includes extra text. So if you have a textual variant, so the big question with the ending of Mark is, where does the Gospel of Mark end? Does it end with the women fleeing from the tomb and saying nothing, for they were afraid? Or does it end with this extra extended ending that goes all the way through to, with this idea of kind of a second Great Commission, if you will, where people are picking up serpents with their hands and drinking deadly poison and not being hurt by it. And then so where does the Gospel of Mark end? There, different texts will say different things. And if you choose to look at this passage, you will evaluate the textual variant. So if you look at the Greek New Testament, you look at the sigla, and it points out, you have the conclusio, or the shorter ending. And you can see which manuscripts do that down here. The majority of Alexandrinus, Where is Sinaiticus? Anyway, the kind of the major players: A, C, D, K, W, Washington, Annis, and then you have others that have a longer ending to it, and you can look at the. I gave you a PDF handout of, and I'm going to hold up this book just so you can see. If you want to do work in this sort of thing, you can find this book, which is a textual commentary on the Greek New Testament by Bruce Metzger. And it basically walks through all of the major textual variants and gives some kind of discussion about them. All right, I'm already going on too long. There's a couple of other ones that you'll look at. I'm going to go to John 7:53. And you can see here, John 7:53, you have the story of the woman caught in adultery. And in the ESV, you've got double brackets, which alerts you that you have a variant here. And you probably have a footnote as well. And your footnote would say something to the effect of some manuscripts do not include 753 to 811. Others add the passage here or after 736 or after John 21:25. Some manuscripts actually have this story in Luke 21:38. So the question is the story of the woman caught in adultery original to John or not? And so you have, again, here is your textual commentary here. I'm going to move back up here. And you can see some add this in, and some omit. Where's my omit? Here's OM. So these are all the texts that add this in. These are all the texts that omit. So here's Sinaiticus, here's Alexandrinus, here's Vaticanus. And these are early major manuscripts that omit this passage. And so that's why it says some manuscripts do not include. So what I'm having you do, the last one is this in 1 John 5. This three that testify. There are three that testify: the Spirit, the water, the blood. These things agree, and there should be a footnote in your Bible as well, talking about there's additional text that is put in there in different manuscripts, although you might not find as much on this one as well. So anyway, all of that to say, you're going to choose one of these three major manuscripts. One of these three major textual variants, and you're going to explain what your Bible says about it. And so I'm looking forward to reading what you have. I just wanted to give you a little color, a little bit of why this is important. Establishing the text is significant. Some are more confident because of the work of textual critics. Others become more skeptical because of the work of textual critics. I happen to be someone who believes that that we can become more and more confident as we do this work, and that we really do need to do this work. So we establish the text every time we come to it. So, all right. Well, I hope that was helpful. I'm looking forward to reading what you guys have this week. All right.